Hello and welcome to another episode of Discussing New Approaches. So this is the show where I sit down with interesting people and discuss new approaches in their fields of expertise. So I'm your host, Eric Walker-Rawson, and I realised I haven't actually done a proper introduction to myself in all of the episodes so far. So I thought I'd take just a brief moment to introduce myself. So I am the founder of Talos Executive Search. So essentially we are a recruitment agency with a specific focus on finding companies, innovative data, AI and technology leaders who can ultimately bring value and revenue to those businesses. So I find myself in the very lucky position of having very intelligent conversations with people who are far more intelligent than I am. But I've always been particularly drawn to fascinating new approaches being taken by these experts. So I thought, why not sit down, start recording some of these conversations, and even treat each season like a potential research topic is probably the best way of describing it. So that's how we're going to move forward. So with this episode, I'm joined by Dr Janet Bastiman, who is a Oxford grad, has a PhD in computational neuroscience and is currently the chief data scientist at Napier AI. And obviously the topic of conversation today is going to be using AI in combating fraud to do with human trafficking. But before we get into that quite meaty subject, it would be great to understand a little bit more about you, Janet. You know, what was your journey like getting to this point where you are now, and what interested you in this as well? What interested you in AI, and I suppose the fraud aspect as well?
Fantastic. Thanks, Eric. It's been quite an odd journey. I mean, I started off in the early 80s coding just because I was of that wondrous generation where we didn't have consoles, and if you wanted to play games, you had to get a very basic computer, the BBC or Acorn Electron back in the day, and code things up yourself. So I've been playing around with computers since I was very young. And then as I moved through school, I didn't really see how exciting it was going to be. I focused on sort of natural sciences, and like you say, I went to Oxford and did biochemistry and molecular sciences as an undergrad. And then as I was coming to the end of that, I was starting to see just how much data made a problem in what we were trying to detect. So when I moved into my PhD, it was looking at all of the signals between neurons and how they communicated and how that led to the patterns that we observe in terms of thought, and even simple things like my PhD was in terms of sort of repetitive patterns in feeding, for example. During that time, there wasn't really the computing power to do anything of note. This is pre-GPU, and you had all of this data, and it was very difficult to do anything with it because you were just limited by what universities had available. So I kind of left academia and I worked my way through sort of development engineering, working my way up to CTO, just looking for interesting, complex problems in a variety of industries. And then about, almost 10 years ago to the day, I had an opportunity to work for a very small AI startup, trying to detect the images in various sports events so that advertisers could see how much airtime they got just from what people were wearing in the crowds or what the players were wearing. And while that didn't work out, it was a real eye-opener to where we could be and where we could go. And it placed me to move into that senior data science role in a variety of companies, leading 5 years ago to joining Napier as chief data scientist to really look at some difficult and important problems. So Napier very much focused on providing solutions to help financial institutions combat all sorts of financial crime, sort of detect and prevent. And the thing with financial crime is that it's so pervasive and it has such a wide effect on society. And sometimes people think that it's not really an issue because they might get refunded by their bank, but they're not getting their money back. They're getting sort of money that the bank holds for these situations. The criminals still have their money when they've been defrauded. And anything that we can do to stop the criminals having access to these large amounts of funds and making it look legitimate is really, really important. But at the same time, we all need to use banking services. So finding that balance between stopping the bad guys but not inconveniencing everyone else is a really hard line to walk. And that's what I find really interesting and fascinating. And that's where I've been applying my skills for the past few years.
Great. got a couple of questions to follow off from that. I think
fine.
that the first one, I'm going to bring it all the way back to the beginning. So can you remember some of the games that you were first coding when you were building these sort of
Yes,
machines?
I still have the book actually. It's like coding games for your microcomputer, and it's one of these ones that's got this beautiful concept art of dragons and monsters, and then a little 8 by 8 pixelated character that wanders around and beeps when it hits monsters and things. And all of those books back in the early 80s, there were always errors in the listings, and you had to sit there and type them out. And part of the skill was, when it didn't run, working out where the problems were. And the book that I had, and I keep it because I find books are a gift that needs to be kept. So I still have a lot of those early things. It's got ideas in as to how you can extend it. So the base game was basically a very simple dungeon crawler where you were going around and hitting things with a sword. And it gave you ideas to think about how you could add magic, and what thinking about sort of key bindings you might need, and what the effects would be, and how to write those subroutines for damage, and could you add in health potions and things like that. So it was a really, really nice way of getting you to think about it. My dad was a teacher, so he was very much of the, if you're going to play games, at least make it educational and learn how to do it. So it was a long time before I got any commercial games. Repton being, I think, the first one, Repton 2,
Wow.
which I still love. I've got an actual old Acorn Electron with Repton 2 that one day I will find the time to sit down and play properly.
I was going to say, yeah, have you sat down and played it, or is it
I've started, but the problem with Repton 2 is, I can cheat these days because you can sort of save the virtual thing, but it didn't have a good save point, so you kind of had to play the whole thing from beginning to end, and it was horrendous, because I think the version that I had as a kid had a bug in it, so it was impossible to complete. But because you bought games on tapes back in the day, there were no over-the-air updates of those sorts of problems. So I'm looking forward to properly completing it one day.
Amazing. And what do you think, I suppose, now of kids being able to, so looking back when you were sort of creating your own games, and now, bringing it back to the topic with AI potentially making their own games, do you think it's, looking back on that time and looking back to now, do you think it's completely changed? What do you think a kid could do with sort of AI powered coding to create their own game?
I think creating, say, cookie cutter games are immensely easy. My daughter's 13. She's been playing around from the past 4 or 5 years with various different game engines, creating simple maze games, or finding, because you've got all the assets are out there and you can string these games together very easily. Are they interesting and exciting and new? Not really. So, but it's enough to give you those skills a lot more easily than just trying to create something from scratch. And it's the same as we saw in website development, is that, when first generation web, if you wanted to create something, you had to understand HTML, you had to understand CSS, you had to understand JavaScript in some cases, just to get a really functional website. Now we've got templates for all of these things, and then you can just focus on the bits you want to change. And game development's going the same way. Get most of your framework in, and then focus on the code for your NPCs, the AI, and see what they're doing and adjust that, rather than trying to do everything. So you can focus skills and talent where it needs to be. And that's what AI gives us, that sort of combination of ease of development and then ability to focus.
Definitely. And bringing it back to something that you brought in a little bit later, because obviously that's related to, I suppose, even what you did later on with the AI. So you mentioned you were sort of more marketing trying. So is that computer vision to try and understand what?
That project was, because one of the things, say 10 years ago or so now, the computer vision was really good in terms of spotting cats and dogs and different things like that, and even logos. But if you look at distorted things, so a logo on clothing, you've got all of the creases, but humans can recognize that really well. We've got very abstract pattern recognition that even when most of the data's missing, we still extrapolate to common things, and we do it very accurately most of the time. So we were doing a lot of research to look at how could we build something that, when the logo was very distorted or slightly obscured because it was from the side view of a player or something, that you could still say, oh, that's that's the Coca-Cola logo, or that's the McDonald's logo, or whatever it turned out to be, or even more complicated ones that you could accurately detect that, because as a human watcher, you'd be influenced by that vision. And it was a very difficult problem, because a lot of the way that these models had been trained back then was very much sort of repetition of thousands of labelled images that were all very clean and very obvious. And starting to look at, well, what happens when it's occluded and what happens when it's distorted makes for a slightly different problem. So that's when I started looking at some of the research that had been done in audio to solve a vision problem. Because if you're thinking of trying to detect what people are saying, I mean, it's fine in this sort of environment, it's nice and clean, but in a crowded room, you've got multiple conversations, you've got other background noise going on. So the ML models that were looking at audio had to clean all of that noise. So applying the same sort of models and techniques to vision gave a much better result. And that's one of the things I've always tried to do, is look at the problem and then try and find similar things from completely separate fields that we can use in order to solve the problem at hand, rather than just looking at a very narrow field of research.
Amazing. And I mean, you said it didn't quite work out at the end, but what were some of the, I suppose, the bits that you took away from that process at the end?
I mean, it was just, I think startups have a limited span. You've got to get customers on board and you've got to get funding. Otherwise, you run out of runway. And I think just the timing of it wasn't quite right. So when we actually had something to demo, it was already past the start of the major season. So all of the brands already had all of their deals on board. So it's difficult to get in. I think the founder pivoted onto something else and just kept that work in his back pocket until he could use it in future. But I mean, the main thing was a combination of sort of like fast-paced development, using ideas from different industries to solve a problem, but also not just relying on throwing money at a problem in order to solve it. And I think that's the thing, and we see it a lot these days, is if a problem's hard, get a bigger GPU, throw more data at it, throw more processing at it, rather than take a step back and go, we can't throw money at this, so how can we think our way out of the problem? And that's where innovation actually happens, is when you're restricted in what you can do, and you've really got to focus on looking for new and innovative ways to solve a problem.
Which I think you can almost see in the AI news happening, or the AI landslide, you might call it, in the last couple of years. I think the most recent example, the DeepSeek fiasco. Although I think some of it's been debunked now, and how revolutionary that was at the time. But the core concept of having their models work in a different way that was a lot more efficient is a lot better. And if you look at things like quantum, which are also on the horizon, that's also about insane ability or power with a lot more minimal, I suppose, infrastructure, more complicated infrastructure. But
it's taking the complexity into a slightly different dimension, but it is a different way of doing things. And that's how we need to innovate. You've got gentle evolutions where, we saw the same thing with sort of computing power generally. It's like the CPUs just getting better and storage getting better, and they were just like doubling every couple of years. And, that's fine, but that will only take you so far. If you want to do something new and exciting and innovative, you've got to look beyond what everyone else is doing and really focus on what can we do that nobody else is doing. What hasn't been tried. And there are so many ideas out there. There's too much research for one person to really cover everything. But just having a good diverse team, we've all got different interests, suddenly you'll get these, what if we tried this? Or I was reading a paper that, my brother gave to me about gravitational waves, and they're applying this approach. So it gives you all of those different ideas, and that's how we managed to move forward.
Is that what drew you to Napier in the end, and that sort of environment of solving those big problems like you mentioned earlier?
It was mainly, the impact of getting this right, because interesting though some of the problems in marketing are, at the end of the day, it is marketing, and nobody's life is really going to be affected one way or the other. So when I was looking to change roles, I wanted to do something that my husband said was worthy. So he was really pushing me to do something that I could look back and be proud of. So he was encouraging me to go into sort of like medical AI or sort of space or something like that. And then when the opportunity at Napier came up and it was sort of like anti-money laundering, anti-financial crime, it was an easy decision because it was something that has a material impact on people worldwide every day.
Mm-hmm. Which I think segues nicely into our first question, because I think when a lot of people think money laundering, and even human trafficking as well, which is we're talking about that, but obviously we're having the wider scope of financial crime. I think a lot of people think, sort of mobsters and running physical money through businesses. So how has that changed, both the sort of money laundering side and the fraud side, connecting to the human trafficking? How has that changed, especially in the modern age and particularly the digital age?
Yeah, it's changed quite considerably. I mean, I think particularly sort of post-COVID, because we're all using a lot less cash. So the way in which they move money around has had to change. I mean, you still get businesses that only accept cash. And just from the nature of my work, I've become incredibly suspicious of any business that only accepts cash. And even those that have a card machine that seems to be permanently broken, because as soon as you've got cash, you've got less traceability of where that money's come from. So you can mix up that legitimate funds with any other money that's been stolen and just change the nature of that funds, and it all looks like it's come from a genuine business transaction. So that has changed. But then equally with sort of the digital space, I mean, people think it's all crypto and that's where the crime is, but it doesn't need to be. It's the same sort of thing. It's just movement of money enough to obscure it and make sure that it looks legitimate. And it can be as simple as buying something with one card and then refunding it onto another. And it just then has a disconnect so that you can't tell where that money came from and its true origins. And it can be as easy as that. And when it comes to some of the wider cases, I mean, saying about sort of human trafficking generally, it's all tied together as there's this whole host of predicate crimes which are designed to either get money from people through fraudulent scams or entrap people into being part of the criminal activity. Because I think a lot of people don't realise that if you are involved in money laundering, you are, at risk of being arrested and prosecuted yourself. So a lot of people, especially now, we've got a lot of people who are struggling for funds, and they see something on TikTok or Facebook or whatever, suggesting a get rich quick scheme. It's like, we just need you to hold this money for a while and you can keep some of it, or pick these goods up and pass them on. Almost certainly is going to be part of one of those criminal enterprises. And if you're making money from it, then you are at risk yourself, because the people running these crimes are happy to have people they can throw under the bus and get arrested. They don't care about you. They're happy to give up large percentages of, the dodgy money that they've got to keep most of it. So anytime I see someone advertising or falling for some of these ways, and you see them advertised where it's like you can make real money, and all you need to, I'm making sort of £2,000 a month working from home, just responding to ads, and you just think that's not great. So the scams have moved into ways that are deliberately designed to entrap people. They prey on the desperate and the vulnerable, and particularly with human trafficking, they're offering something. They're offering that escape route. They're offering to transport them to a new city, a new country, or for a job, and saying that there's a job. And in some cases, they're paying the transport, and then once they're there, they're then restricted from what they can do. They're denied access to funds, and they're denied access to travel, and they're then used to either work as part of other criminal enterprises, launder money themselves, or actually commit all these other frauds and scams themselves. They're forced into it, and then the money that they generate then gets filtered through as any other financial crime.
Wow. Okay, so again, I suppose I can see where you're talking about in terms of impact, because it's I suppose, is it hard to trace back to, so someone is caught up in this, obviously they're used as it sounds like as a scapegoat
Yeah.
of a lot of ways. I mean, I almost equate it to um, sort of a more physical world of sort of drug dealing, because it's, you often have the sort of again, my knowledge is lacking on it, but you usually have sort of the people who are pulling the strings, and then you have people on the street who share, don't get as much of the money, but have a way more risk because they're on the front lines, much more likely to get picked up. So this seems like the equivalent, but in a
Yeah, it's very similar, and part of the trafficking approach is people who will be put to work in similar ways, doing sort of drug running and things like that. But it's also wider. It's the people who are forced to be domestic servants. It's the people who are forced to work jobs that they don't actually see their pay from, and things like that. And they're put in that position through being picked up through these dodgy ads promising too much. And it all starts with that reaching out and the coercive control. And even if you've maybe tried one of these schemes and you think, oh, I'll make a quick £100, and then they can start blackmailing you, telling you it's a criminal offence, and then force you into a position where you feel like you're trapped and there's no way out. So it's very, very interconnected between both sides of the equation in terms of how they treat people and how those people then get caught up and are pretty much unable to escape this situation. I mean, even you think of this almost as like it's a foreign problem and people are bringing people into this country, but even people in the UK, I think the last stats were over 100,000 people, native UK people were part of human trafficking rings just in this country alone. It's absolutely terrible.
wow. Like I said, how do you know? Speaking from a data perspective, how do you track the data back? Because obviously you're looking for, like you mentioned, fraudulent card. You're looking at certain transactions, but obviously in a sea of other transactions and in a sea of data, how do you pick at that to try and understand the the ones that might be?
With great care. It's really, really difficult because you have, if you think of all of the transactions just in the UK on a daily basis and how frequently we all make transactions and how different they are. I mean, for example, I've come in to do this recording today. I've been making purchases in a different place at different times to when I normally do. And that will flag up on my record. I mean, it'll be a low risk because the values aren't particularly high, but it will flag up. So what you're looking for is a combination of differences and differences that are beyond normal levels of unusual, because we all have variations. There's sort of periodicity in how we spend and transact based, obviously, Black Friday, Christmas, birthdays, even as we change work and travel around. And then there's also longer term periodicity for the bigger purchases, so things like getting loans and, buying significant birthday presents or cars or, changing the furniture in your house, stuff that you don't do monthly but might do over several years. That all needs to be taken into account. But then what you're looking for is things where there's a significant change. So either I suddenly start sending money to somebody new that I've not interacted with before, and that person's suddenly getting a lot of payments from multiple people that they've never interacted with before. Those become spike points in the data that you then need to investigate. But it's so subtle in such a sea of data that it's very, very hard to say for certain that anything is going on. So all the financial institutions can do is gather the data as much as possible and then submit it as potential evidence. And that's kind of how these things work. We have a whole load of typologies that the banks are looking for. And, we don't want to go into too much detail of what they are, because then anyone listening to this will go, I'll stop doing that then. But there's a lot of very, very detailed tracking that's done, and then there's a lot of analytics that are done, and then they're merged together in order to get these risk profiles, which can then be investigated further.
That's a good catch. Not saying what you want them to hear, if that makes sense. But I think, so you mentioned COVID earlier, and then there was a spike, which is interesting. I think a lot of things, the more you understand about COVID, the more there was a sort of paradigm shift for a lot of industries and in a lot of ways. Do you know how large that shift was when we moved towards a cashless environment, and does that make it harder? Now if there are more digital transactions, if there are more data, and like you mentioned that sea of data, has it changed from a lake into an ocean, and does that make it harder to find these things?
Yes and no. In some respects, it makes it slightly easier because there's less cash flowing around. The bad transactions have to be digital to hide in the sea, because if you're moving large amounts of cash around, that does get picked up. I mean, I remember myself about 10 years ago, I think there were 3 weeks on the trot where I was paying in large amounts of cash to the bank because, my husband had a big poker win, and we'd sold, I think I'd sold one of those robotic dogs, the Ibo, and various other things. So I was walking into my bank with cash, and they did ask me where I got it from. It was part of standard procedures just to check what was going on. But of course, these days that's not happening. Other than businesses, people aren't tending to walk into banks with large amounts of cash to pay in. And what we saw over COVID was that huge drop in cash because we all stopped going out. So we were buying lots of food online and doing lots of digital transactions, and very, very little was cash based. Off the top of my head, I don't know the figures. It had been declining for years, but it was like through the floor for a few months, and then it crept back up. But what we started to see is a switch to the use of other ways of moving things. So, for example, we know that around about that time, there were a lot of businesses that got set up, mainly because a lot of people pivoted and started trying new things when they were laid off and started building up their own businesses, but also businesses doing things that there was much bigger need of. So delivery companies, funeral homes, that sort of thing. There's a huge spike that you can see on HMRC for the registration of those sorts of companies. And that in itself probably wasn't a thing of note because, yeah, everyone's using these. But that's where a lot of this criminal activity was hidden, because you could then funnel funds through companies that you'd expect to be created, that you would also expect to go from nothing to quite high turnover in their first year of business, and then would probably shut down within 18 months. So things like that are very important to look for. The shell companies that are registered in odd places, that's all pretty standard, and that's all happening. So it's doing that known stuff and then digging beneath for the more complex signals that makes it difficult. But the move to digital has made it so that the signals are there, because you go back sort of 20, 30 years, you could run your business pretty much on paper and with cash, and it would be fine and no one would know any different.
Which is again really interesting. Have you, so with these companies, it sounds like they're quick to open, quick to close. Are there ones that are harder to detect because they have been open for a lot longer? Do these storefronts have, or these businesses have actual storefronts? Oftentimes,
potentially, it's a combination of all of those things. So you have businesses that are starting to fail, where the owner wants out and they can sell on that business. That happens. You see quite often on Companies House, businesses will change hands, and businesses will sort of change what they're doing. Because if you've got an established business name, then it's already got bank accounts, it's already got that trading history, so it's seen as lower risk. And we see the same with individual accounts as well, particularly with people leaving the country. They don't need their UK bank account anymore, and there's ways that they can then pass that on. So a criminal has full access to an account that, the original owner doesn't care about. And it looks legitimate because it's had normal activity for a number of years. And then to your point, you can also get those businesses that operate completely legitimately for years, but just funnel through illegitimate funds. So all of this is happening in parallel, which again makes it difficult to detect because you're looking for lots of different types of patterns within the same sea of data.
Yeah, which is interesting. I think because my mind goes to the entertainment factor. I think as most people
Hmm.
do, you're thinking Breaking Bad, Walter White, car wash, laundering money through that way. But it sounds like that's still happening, but it sounds like it's a lot more digitally focused now in terms of the laundering side, because it's easier to almost be a little bit of a ghost, sort of cutting things down, putting things up, taking over from existing accounts, things of that nature.
Yeah, a lot of that is very easy to do. It's very automated, and as a country, we make it very easy to open up a business, and you can use various shell offices almost, sort of, if so that you're not giving out your home address, and that's all perfectly straightforward. And a lot of people have done that for very legitimate reasons. I mean, you still have the cash-based stuff, um, but just because the amount of cash is dropping, that is less than it used to be. But it's still there, absolutely. And you'll find an awful lot of cash-based businesses, of which, most are quite legitimate and for various reasons, whether it's sort of the fees that card providers charge or just because of the sort of business that, goes to markets or is regularly dealing with lower amounts. They just don't see the need of having all of that side. But then you also have plenty who will literally refuse anything else and will ask you to go withdraw money from the cash point if you want to buy whatever it is they've got on their stall, or have the car wash, or have your nails done, or whatever it turns out to be. There are still plenty of those around because cash is a lot harder to trace, because we tend not to make a note of the serial number of every single note that's deposited into a bank account or withdrawn from a cash machine. I think we have it in the cash machines, but it gets moved around so much that traceability is really hard. So the criminals will still want to use cash because it's easy, but a lot of businesses that have the high asset items that they normally buy tend not to take cash as much. They tend to be digital transactions. So getting that money into a place where they can legitimately hand over a card and it looks like honestly earned money is key for them.
And what are your thoughts on sort of, I suppose, a cashless society? Because that's some people have argued that's what we're moving towards, and versus, would a criminal favour cash over things like crypto, for example? Because obviously that they can both be utilised in different ways for anonymity. But do you think there's, if we're in a cashless society, it will be forced into crypto? Is it the criminal element that's keeping cash alive, or combined with an older generation?
I mean, there's definitely the older generation, and there's definitely, even in the younger generation, that fear of the big brother fear, because they don't necessarily want everyone to know what they're spending their money on. And these are the same people that sort of like don't want the all of the apps and everything else because they just don't want to be traced. And while that is predominantly the older generation, a lot of younger people are starting to feel that way and feel sort of less comfortable with the amount of data that we're being asked to share on a daily basis. And I think that's a key thing, because we've gone through this renaissance of here are all these free wonderful social media apps, but you're giving up your data. You are the product. All of those photos and status updates and everything else you've shared have now been used to train the algorithm and to train various models, and it's now selling stuff back to you. So all of that is out there. And if you think about the loyalty cards when you go to the supermarket, and they've got every single thing you've bought and how frequently you've bought it, and whether you've bought it at the big discount size or the little size, and how they can then use that to target you. Adding all that together, and the thought of putting that with your health data from the NHS and everything else, and potentially insurance companies having access to that data, worries a lot of people. So there's an awful lot of resistance, I think, to going fully cashless, but not by everybody. Some people don't care, and I think there will always be some people that are genuinely worried and afraid about what that data could be put together for.
Do you think it could be put together for malicious purposes?
Yes, very easily.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much data out there, and I think we're all or we have all been quite lax with what we've shared. And it's possibly recently that we've started taking a little bit more care and looking at, like, actually, no, I don't want cookies from this website. And actually, no, I don't want to give you my email address just to get a receipt and things like that, just to try and take a bit more ownership of where things are. But if you look at the amount of data that we all have that's digitized and how easily it is to get back to us, that combining all of that into a picture would be very easy. And once you have that, the scope for malice is quite high. One of the things that I've been talking about recently in terms of some of the bad uses of AI is how easily it is now to do a lot of these scams at scale. So it used to be that, we'd all get the email about, the foreign prince has lots of money and everyone would just delete it. And then it started to become a little bit more targeted. So it was the email that looked like it was from someone you worked with asking you to buy, those like Google Play cards or whatever and send them the codes, or the text messages that just go, "Hi mom, I've lost my phone. Can you send £20 to this number and they'll give me money for a taxi?" Those sorts of things. But now it's very, very possible for someone to take at scale a combination of numbers and who owns them, because all of that data has been leaked multiple times. Again, completely automatically look up pictures, look up any voice clips. You can phone someone, you get those silent calls, you go, "Hello, hello," you get 30 seconds of voice that you can then use to train a deepfake voice model, and you can create a phone call or even a FaceTime that makes you think you're speaking to someone you're not, who's then asking you for money. And that can be done automated at scale now. So the more information that's out there, the easier it is for us to succumb to things. And you wrap all of that up with, this is happening at both ends of the chain. Going back to what I was talking about with some of the scams, having that feeling of authenticity, that you're talking to a real person and that they care about you. And yes, this is a genuine job offer. We just need you to get on a bus and come to this city and we'll meet you here. And it looks like a genuine conversation when it's possibly done by someone who doesn't look or sound like anything the person you're talking to. And then you get on that bus and you go to that place, and then you're mixed up in everything and you have that problem that you might not be able to escape.
Which is terrifying. That's a terrifying concept. Do you think we should be more careful with our data then? So obviously, even like you said, even just giving your email to get a receipt from a company, obviously information now, which I don't think people realise, is bought and sold a lot, even by big companies. They'll buy and sell information because it's useful to funnel marketing, to funnel other things. And like you said, it can get leaked, it can get collected, and obviously algorithms and analytics improve both from a good actor side and also a bad actor side. So is there a way to protect your own data against fraudulent activity, or is it nigh on impossible and you've just got to try and think twice about giving data out now?
I think definitely think twice. I think for most of us, all of the information's out there, so you just need to be as careful as you can when you're contacted. The rise of AI has made a lot of these scams so much more difficult to spot. It used to be look out for the typos and look out for, the websites that aren't quite right. But using generative AI, you can run a bit of broken English through and it will be turned into something a lot more convincing, that reads better, that has no spelling mistakes in it, no grammatical errors into it, and it looks a bit more genuine. And particularly with the right prompts for the right person and, extra bits, it feels very authentic. So you need to think about different ways of combating that, making sure that you have an agreement with the people close to you. It's like, if you ever phone me and you're desperate and you need money and I can't phone you back on your number, this is what we're going to say. So that you then have those sorts of things. And for businesses, making sure that you have a process. So you might think you're talking to someone you're not. There was a case last year of an architecture company that was defrauded out of millions because someone in the finance department thought they were speaking to the CFO based in the UK, and it was completely deepfaked. So having that sort of secondary processes in place, really just standard, don't think quickly, don't be pressured into doing things quickly, and double check, has to be part and parcel of our day-to-day lives, because it's going to become harder and harder to spot these things.
It almost seems from a cybersecurity perspective, and I hear this from people in the industry a lot, that the biggest risk to your company or to yourself is the human element. But it also seems like the human element could also be your biggest asset. And it seems like data literacy and fraudulent data literacy is going to be quite important. And I suppose even something that should probably be taught to younger generations,
Yes.
data.
No, absolutely. I think I did a talk, gosh, about 7, 8 years ago now, and I literally said that this critical thinking is more important than mathematics as a skill going forward, because we are moving into an age where all of this is going to become so difficult to differentiate, that you need to have that ability to stop and think and understand where things are, and also be aware of how easy it is to do a lot of this stuff, because you don't need the latest top of the range, tens of thousands of pounds computers. You can do this sort of thing on an old gaming laptop. I have a 10-year-old gaming laptop with quite an old GPU on it, and that's powerful enough for me to alter my face and voice on a live video call.
Yeah, I've heard something equally terrifying, or read something equally terrifying in a book recently that was, it's really easy to make the next super virus, all somewhat because of where technologies have dropped dramatically in price as they scale. Someone can buy a DNA sequencer for what was previously really expensive, now is actually quite cheap and affordable. And all they need is, especially now with AI, all they need is motivation. And they can pretty much sort out how to make the next deadly virus and potentially release it, which is a similar sort of thing. It's the access to these things is becoming a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, I
AI.
think in that specific example, there's still a level of knowledge that they'd need in order to.
I think the caveat was a degree level of knowledge, or at least an A level equivalent of knowledge, to be able to do
but
something
again,
like
that
that.
would probably go down in time. But yeah, it's like technology is a wonderful thing, and it's making our lives easier in so many ways. But we do have an obligation to be mindful of the ways in which it can go wrong, and the earlier we think about these things and the earlier we discuss them, the earlier we can come up with the correct mitigation strategies. As one of the things that we have with AI, because it was driven by the academic community for so long, it's all open source and it's all out there. And we've talked about guardrails and we've talked about ethical AI a lot, but because it's out there, the only people that need to do it in an ethical way and in the guardrails will be the people that are working within the law. And if you're already dealing with a group of people who are outside the rule of law, then they will use it in whatever way they need to make, get to wherever they want to get to with it. So that's the problem that we have with this. And I think as we move into the sort of quantum ML space, we've got the opportunity to define that now, because it's going to be a long time before quantum computers are going to be, in everyone's house. It's going to be a while before we get there. I mean, maybe sooner than we all think, but we have a period of time. So because of the potential of these, particularly in the cybersecurity space and how much damage they could do, we need to get that in place now. We've already missed the boat on a lot of the AI related things, so we're going to have to combat that by looking at sort of like low-tech human solutions.
Again, I agree with you missing the boat on the AI stuff, and that's what makes quantum infinitely interesting, I think. But what's stopping quantum from being in? I think I probably know the answer, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on what's stopping quantum from being in the everyday home, and it's being, I suppose, more protected in that sort of industrial enterprise level organizations.
I mean, it's right now, it's just down to how difficult it is to create the qubits in a way that is cheap enough for mass production and maintain them in a way that can cope with the home environment. It's exactly the same as the initial computers were, that were the size of small houses and and then they gradually got smaller and smaller and more accessible. While I don't necessarily want it to be completely kept within the industrial sphere, because I'm a big believer in like knowledge should be open and accessible to everyone, we do need to look at making sure that things that have the potential to be dangerous are made accessible in the right way. And that's a really fine line to walk, but we've got to do it for the quantum stuff. It's essential. I mean, we're already getting access to some of the quantum machines outside, but really having that available to anyone to do what they want with, we need to understand where those limits are.
Definitely. And I suppose, I mean, it sounds like we've missed the boat on the AI side for now, purely because of how quickly it's scaling. But do you think, I mean, how are you using AI within your current organization, and how are you using AI to combat the type of fraud that we've been talking about? Because it sounds like, although it can be used for bad, and by bad actors, how is it being utilized for good? How are we utilizing it to ultimately protect people?
Well, what we've got is, as humans, we have a difficulty in spotting patterns in large seas of data, and that AI is very, very good at that. So we have a combination of, say, quite low-level statistical techniques. There are some people who say AI is just statistics with a fancy wrapper, and they've got a fair point. So you've got some traditional statistical techniques. We have various, I'd say, lower level machine learned algorithms, and then a whole host of different sort of higher level techniques, sort of supervised, semi-supervised and unsupervised approaches. We have predictions, and we're looking at, in that sea, where are the currents going? Where are the changes going? Are there specific typologies that we can identify? And if so, how strongly can we identify them and surface those? Are we seeing behavioural changes that indicate that there's a risk that's evolving, that's something new that we haven't seen before? And can we expose those, along with enough explanation that a human user looking at it can really understand why that particular set of transactions is potentially an issue or suspicious in any way. So one of the big things that we're focusing on at Napier is making sure that we are compliance first rather than AI first. So we're not just slapping in AI for the sake of it. It's got to have a distinct purpose, and it's got to be understandable by the analyst that's making those decisions. So it's an informational support tool that they can then use to make what are quite high-risk decisions, because if you get this wrong and you raise suspicion, then you can end up really impacting some of the most vulnerable in society, particularly because when you look at financial patterns, you can have, particularly in this country, someone who's on a non-standard income pattern. Maybe they're working 3 or 4 0-hour jobs, so their pay is at different times of the month, at different amounts from month to month, and what's going in is literally almost being taken out because they're maybe stuffing envelopes with cash to save up for their bills, or they've got to put money on a gas card rather than paying by direct debit because they don't have the credit rating. That unpredictability overlaps very strongly with some of the sort of lower end financial crime typologies of accounts that are just being used as stopgap accounts where money is put in by one person and taken out by another. So understanding the difference between those sorts of accounts is really important, and the AI solutions can help with that, because what looks on the surface like it could be completely random, you start to see some of the patterns within, and you then apply that on a network level, and you start looking at where that money's moving from, who are the beneficiaries and originators of each transaction, and the times of day, and where the different cash points are. All of that sort of information all comes together to build a better picture of whether that's a real person that you need to look after or someone that you might need to watch more closely.
Which is interesting. So is it almost, so you mentioned, I've got a couple of questions around this. So you mentioned sort of predictive earlier, so can you almost predict someone based on their previous history? And obviously the most importantly is the changes, but before those changes happen, can you almost interpret where AI is probably better at analyzing the data than a human would be, the sort of small micro changes that are heading towards a path of someone becoming very susceptible to that type of scamming and ultimately entrapment by those types of bad actors.
Yes, exactly that. What you can see is those transactions that feel slightly unusual
Mm.
for somebody, maybe of that demographic, of that previous history. And that then allows the financial institutions to watch that individual a bit more closely and make sure that, when they come into branch, they can ask the right questions and really look at what's going on, particularly with a lot of the scams we've seen where people are extracting money from savings accounts for various reasons. And those sorts of things could be quite legitimate, just in terms of, okay, well, I've got a new account that's got a better interest rate on it, or, I'm treating my children to a holiday, whatever. But when you start seeing some of those patterns, they can form the basis of romance scams, they can form the basis of coercion scams, and all sorts of things like that. So the AI is really good at picking up on where those changes are happening and how frequently, so that you can make a decision on how quickly you need to act compared to just monitoring.
So how does it go through that process of, is it because AI is quicker and can work for longer and has higher computational power than humans can? It's better at sort of the pattern recognition. It's maybe a series of AI that can work in tandem with each other.
A little bit of all of this. As I said, humans are really bad at spotting patterns in large amounts of data. So when you look at a transaction, there's potentially a lot of fields. So you're not just looking at the amount, you've got to think sort of like the time, the date, the location, who's it coming from, who's it going to, was it cash, was it check, was it card, did it go through any other intermediates before it went between the originator and beneficiary. And there's in some cases hundreds of fields that make up a transaction request that the bank stores. And really looking at that, if you can imagine that in a big spreadsheet, one transaction sort of 200 columns wide, and then multiply that by, I don't know, a million, a billion, the amount of transactions that would be going through the system. It's very hard to spot the ones that are unusual, because that's just a point in time, and then you've got to look at every single one of those transactions compared to previous hours, days, weeks, months, years in some cases, to look at where those patterns are. And humans are really bad at that. We just can't see it. We get data blind, and even when you're looking at high level statistics and various BI tools, it's very, very difficult to spot those changes. There's an awful lot of techniques that you can use to transform that data into ways that various AI models can look at more precisely. And a lot of those have come out of various time series models, as well as vision and audio models, because this is a very complex interconnected weave pattern. And you can then pull out where you're getting frequencies that don't match what you'd expect. And then you can take that data and run it through other models to then look at, okay, this is something we don't expect. Can we then say that this is a particular typology, or is it just unusual? And how can we then describe what we're seeing in a way that a human can then pick it up and escalate it, or let us know that it's nothing to worry about, and record and audit that decision so we can then take that back in to train the models.
Amazing. So they're almost getting better the more you use them and the more data that gets fed into them, especially the successful transactions, it seems like. So when you've successfully spotted or caught something that leads to a successful outcome, I'm guessing you have to sort of get an idea of the entire process of that sort of supply chain, where if you do manage to spot something, and you've got to work in tandem with things like banks and other, I suppose, even end of that supply chain where people getting caught.
And that is the difficulty, is that you have different levels of success. So are you flagging a success because a human agent wanted to investigate it further? Or do you wait until you can tie that transaction or group of transactions back to a criminal prosecution? Because that could be years later. So there's a certain balance between, is is the truth of what we want the models to learn based on what a human wants to see, which has inherent problems around sort of bias and observability, versus is this something that's been thoroughly investigated and has caused a conviction, which may even not be tied back to that original piece of data, because it could be a collaboration of a whole load of data from lots of different institutions, and the piece that you raised might just be a correlation rather than a causation. So do you want to learn from it or not? And that's also a very tricky balance.
So again, I suppose you've got to look at the data quality. So what are you putting in to these models, which
Yeah.
probably has to make it very clean, very succinct, in order to get the right transaction. I suppose, can you, these things are getting better all the time. Can you target, I suppose, what you might call the big players, the people who ultimately you want to go after? Because we've talked about, I suppose, the lower end of that supply chain, the people who do get scammed, and obviously they're a lot easier to convict potentially because they're front line, I suppose you might call, to a lot of these fraudulent activities. So they're probably easier to spot by the algorithms because their data is more accessible, I suppose, and less hidden in a lot of ways. But I suppose, has AI made it easier to go after the bigger players in these worlds?
In some respects, the problem we have there is that the bigger players are very motivated and well funded to keep themselves hidden. We know that they have their own data scientists who are actively working against us to try and hide everything. So, and there are so many levels of removal that it does make it a lot harder to tie something that's obvious to the people pulling the strings. But it has helped because, again, it's a large amount of data, but it does require a little bit more cooperation between institutions in order to pull all of that information together.
Amazing. Okay, so there is sort of light at the end of the tunnel in some respects,
Yeah,
as in it's improving.
it is improving.
So you mentioned you want to make sure the data is clean, and I suppose this comes into ethical considerations. So what are some, obviously, improving AI and releasing it onto the market, like we mentioned earlier, has technological repercussions in terms of societal levels and everything else. So are there other ethical considerations you need to think about when you are improving AI within this field, knowing that there are, like you said, people on the opposite side essentially moving against you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the main thing is really looking at, from our training data point of view, and making sure that we've really focused on the behaviours and not necessarily the anything else to do with that individual, because it would be very easy to look at the sort of the correlation between the transaction patterns and specifically the sorts of transactions, so nail bars, car washes, someone that's regularly interacting with businesses that might be known to be suspicious does not necessarily make them directly suspicious. So really focusing on how do we train these models so that they pick up the typologies without learning specific bias things about an individual, about where that individual lives and shops, or what work they do, or even what sort of things that they purchase. Because the last thing you want is a model that works well on your training data, but then when you put it in the wild, is suddenly flagging up people who all happen to buy from the same convenience store. Because that's the sort of thing that tends to happen with AI models if you don't monitor them carefully. So you really need to focus on that and make sure that we're not indirectly targeting what is the most vulnerable section of society. We've got to focus on people that we have genuine suspicion are involved in criminal activity.
Which I suppose is almost difficult because it sounds like, from what you were saying earlier, that obviously the most vulnerable people are targeted from this type of fraudulent activity, which means that the AI is sort of pointing in the right direction, but you've got to make sure it points in a very specific direction and gets it right. Is there a way of sort of trying to protect? Is there sort of safeguards that you put in place, or is it, again, just comes back to that training? And
it's training and testing. And I think for me personally at Napier, we make sure that we've got a diverse team looking at this. Too often in the financial sector, you have data scientists who've come from the same sort of backgrounds, gone to the same universities, and the thought of paying your utility bills by going to a shop with a £20 note and a card that you then have to put in a meter, they might not even know anybody that does that. So that idea of having to stuff envelopes with cash, or not having that defined income, might not occur to them. So when they're building models, they'll look for that. Oh, there's a regular salary income at the end of the month and regular direct debits, and then we just need to focus on these transactions in the middle. Doesn't work when you have different spending patterns, or you have almost financial coercive control in relationships, which is more common than it should be, where you have one person who controls all of the money and only lets the other person have enough just to cover the bills. And those sorts of things, if you're not aware of them and you see them come out of the models, it's very easy to just put them in the bucket of suspicious. And that's not what we want to do. You need to have that diversity of thought and diversity of experience in order to come up with models that aren't biased towards vulnerable individuals.
Yeah, which is, again, it's interesting. I think what you mentioned there about the people side is really important. Again, as a recruiter, I would say that, but I think it oftentimes when we're talking about AI, it usually comes back down to the human element. It's AI is very effective. It's a force multiplier in a lot of cases, but it does come down to diversity of thought from the human element that's being enhanced by that thought process. So it's almost, again, this may be an indication to other banks or financial institutions that building a team around sort of idea of diversity of thought will make your aim of what you're trying to do better. It sounds like what you're trying to say.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it'll make the models better generally, because if you have a group of people who've all been, to one of the same 5 universities and all worked for, the same big banks, they'll solve problems in the same way, because that's how they'll have been trained to think. And what you really want is that collaborative approach where people are bringing different ideas to the table, because that's how you innovate. That's how you get the better solutions. So it's absolutely critical that you embrace people with different experiences. Otherwise, you'll never be able to make that leap and be ahead of the people that we're trying to catch.
And I suppose keeping ahead and an eye to the future, with the final question, I would say, what do you think the future of this technology looks like? Or what do you think the future of AI, using AI to combat fraud, looks like? Is there a potential endpoint with what you're trying to do here? Or is it a war that will be waged forever?
Sadly, I think it's going to be a war that's going to be waged forever, until we move into a Star Trek utopia where money doesn't really exist. Just because while there's money, there will be people that want it, that don't deserve it. There will be criminal activity to get it, and there will be further criminal activity to hide the sources of it so people can't be arrested. That's going to keep happening. As the technology improves, it's going to improve on both sides. So it will be a constant struggle. I think as a society, we need to be aware of how people can get caught up in it. So how seemingly innocent things where you can make money are part of the criminal supply chain, and that it's not just, oh, I can get cheaper presents for Christmas, or, I can make a little bit of extra money as a side hustle, and to genuinely think how these things could be part of a wider scam culture. Because the more we can educate people to cut out some of these avenues, the more it will funnel them into ways that are possibly more detectable, or at least a narrower problem, which would make my life easier.
Yes, yeah, and making your life easier is beneficial for everyone, and I think that's a good place to sort of finish. I think it's education, specifically AI and data education, for everyone, because it's, again, if the human element is easier to spot these sorts of things, there's less fraudulent activity, and even, I suppose, more support in place for people who do get entrapped as well, then hopefully things like this, where we are talking about it, might be able to play a bit of a difference in that, and people might be able to think, okay, well, let's actually look into this a little bit more, or even hopefully join the fight for the good as well. More intelligent people working to try and tip the scales, maybe with things like quantum. If quantum comes into play, that, would you say, as a last follow-up question, do you think quantum would be harder for bad actors to replicate compared to good?
It depends on their access. I strongly suspect that they're gearing up and educating themselves to be ready for it. So if they have access, that they will make as much use of it as me and my team are starting to gear up and ready for making use of it. So it's going to depend on access and guardrails, I think.
But on that note, do you think there's a good note to end it on? Do you think there's a bit of hope for the future as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, the hope for the future is down to that education piece.
Yeah.
And that if we can make people realise that, this is not a victimless crime by any means, and, the money that goes, even if you get money back, it's not your original money. The money has still gone to the criminals. And if you see these schemes that are too good to be true, where you can make money working from home or doing whatever else it turns out to be, where you'll get money for doing something that's not a real job, be suspicious and just be aware that you're probably going to get sucked in to be part of the problem, and potentially could get caught up in being further blackmailed by these individuals. And, it can literally ruin people's lives. So the more we can educate people on what can happen and make them aware of it, then the easier it'll be to protect them.
Perfect, and I think that's a great place to end it with education, and the plea to people to go and educate themselves as well as taking advice from this. But I think that's, again, like I said, a great place to stop. I want to say a big thank you to Janet for joining us today, and thank you everyone else for listening and tuning in. Remember to like, subscribe, follow, do whatever you have to do on any device or anything else that you're looking or seeing this on or watching it on, to catch more episodes as they come. And remember, this doesn't have to be the end of the discussion as well. So if you have any thoughts around what we've discussed today, any questions, anything that you want to raise, post them in the comments below. I'll be monitoring everything, and then if I get enough of them, we might even be able to do a follow-up later on, do some sort of Q&A where we can actually respond to direct questions. Hope to spread the education a little bit further, which was a good ending point. But that's all from us today, and so thank you and goodbye.